The night air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as Susan Poupart stepped out of the house party in Lac du Flambeau, Wisconsin. The distant sound of laughter and music still echoed behind her, but the chill of early morning had begun to settle in, wrapping around her like an omen. It was May 20th, 1990, and the sky was a deep, endless black, punctuated only by the dull glow of a street lamp flickering in the distance. She wasn't alone. Two men flanked her, their voices low, their movements tense. A witness later recalled that she didn't seem to be leaving of her own free will. Something in her posture, the stiffness of her shoulders, the hesitation in her steps, it all suggested unease. As they neared a parked car, Susan hesitated. The briefest pause, a silent plea that went unnoticed in the shadows. And then she was gone. That was the last time anyone saw Susan Poupart alive. Welcome to Tearful Tales. Here we dig into the story that touches the soul. Thank you for joining us in another video. Kindly subscribe, like and share, and please let us know where you are watching from. Susan Poupart arrived at the party around 9 p.m., her smile lighting up the dimly lit room. She was known for her warm spirit and infectious laughter. A devoted mother of two who carried the weight of responsibility, but still managed to find joy in moments like these. Inside the small house, the scent of beer and cigarette smoke mingled with the sound of music playing from a stereo in the corner. Friends chatted in clusters, their voices rising above the music. Susan greeted familiar faces, embracing friends she hadn't seen in weeks. It felt good to let loose, even just for a night. As the party picked up, Susan caught the attention of two men standing near the back of the room. They were older, not part of her usual crowd. Their quiet demeanor stood out against the lively atmosphere. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, watched her intently while whispering to his companion. Susan noticed their gaze but dismissed it, focusing instead on catching up with friends. As the hours passed, Susan found herself deep in conversation with a childhood friend, reminiscing about their school days and sharing updates about their families. The friend commented on how hard Susan worked to provide for her kids. "You deserve to enjoy yourself more," the friend said, raising her cup in a toast. Susan laughed, nodding in agreement. By midnight, the party was in full swing, but Susan began to feel uneasy. The two men had moved closer, their presence becoming harder to ignore. One of them tried to strike up a conversation, asking where she lived and whether she needed a ride home. She brushed him off politely but firmly, returning to her circle of friends. As the clock struck 4 a.m. and the party had dwindled to only a handful of guests, the once boisterous laughter had been replaced by quiet conversations and the occasional clink of bottles being cleared away. Outside, the chill of early morning settled over the neighborhood, casting a serene but eerie calm. Susan decided it was time to leave. She had work in the morning and couldn't afford to stay out any later. Outside, the night was still and dark, the only light coming from a street lamp near the edge of the driveway. Susan stood near her car, fumbling in her bag for her keys. As she searched, the two men from earlier approached her. She tensed, her instincts warning her of danger. Susan Poupart stood in the dim light near the edge of the driveway, keys in hand. She glanced around, her face reflecting a mix of fatigue and mild apprehension. Her friend, watching from the doorway, hesitated. Something about the scene felt off. The two men who had lingered around Susan throughout the night now stood beside her, speaking in low tones. One of the men, taller and more imposing, gestured toward his car. "Let us drive you home," he said, his voice unusually smooth, as if trying to soothe her. The shorter man stayed quiet, his eyes darting between Susan and the car. Susan shifted her weight uncomfortably, glancing back toward the house. She could feel the unease curling in her chest. "I've got my car," she said, her voice firm but calm. "I'll be fine." The taller man took a step closer, blocking her path slightly. "Come on," he insisted, his tone now tinged with impatience. "It's late, and you shouldn't be driving alone. It's not safe." Her friend took a step forward, calling out, "Susan, you sure you don't want me to follow you home?" Susan turned toward her, her expression unreadable. "I'm okay," she replied, but her voice lacked conviction. The taller man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll make sure she gets there," he said, his tone final, as if dismissing any further objections. Susan's friend lingered in the doorway, torn. Something felt wrong, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She watched as the men ushered Susan toward their vehicle, a nondescript car parked at the curb. Susan hesitated briefly before climbing into the back seat. As the car doors closed, the shorter man glanced back toward the house, his expression fleetingly nervous before he climbed into the passenger seat. The car pulled away slowly, its taillights disappearing into the darkened street. It wasn't until the vehicle was out of sight that Susan's friend realized she had been holding her breath. A knot of worry settled in her stomach. "I should have stopped her," she muttered under her breath, retreating back into the house. The car carrying Susan Poupart disappeared into the night, the hum of the engine fading into silence. The streets of Lac du Flambeau were empty at that hour, illuminated only by scattered streetlights casting long shadows on the asphalt. Susan sat in the back seat, her hands resting on her lap, trying to push down the growing unease in her chest. The two men in the front seat exchanged brief glances, their conversation quiet, almost conspiratorial. Susan shifted uncomfortably, the realization sinking in that she didn't recognize the area they were driving through. The houses and familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by dark stretches of road and dense trees lining the edges of the highway. "This doesn't look like the way to my house," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness. The driver, the taller of the two men, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Relax," he said, his tone casual. "Just taking a shortcut." Susan's unease turned to alarm. "I don't need a shortcut, just take me home." The shorter man in the passenger seat turned slightly, offering a tight, insincere smile. "We'll get you there," he said, his words doing little to reassure her. Susan's pulse quickened. Her instincts screamed at her to act, but she was trapped, 3 doors between her and freedom, each one feeling like an impossible barrier. Back at home, the sun was beginning to rise. Susan's children, still too young to understand time, woke up and began asking for breakfast. Her family noticed her absence but didn't panic at first. Susan had stayed out late before, maybe she'd decided to crash at a friend's house. But as the hours ticked by and there was still no word from her, the worry began to set in. Phone calls were made. Friends from the party were contacted, each one recounting the same story. Susan had left with 2 men in a car, and no one had seen her since. Susan's parents, deeply rooted in the community, began driving around town, retracing possible routes she might have taken. They checked every spot she frequented, her workplace and local hangouts. By evening, the fear was palpable. Susan's mother clutched the phone, waiting for it to ring, praying for her daughter's voice on the other end. Instead, only silence filled the house, interrupted by the occasional whimper of her youngest grandchild. At the same time, Susan's friends were battling their own guilt. The friend who had watched her leave with the men replayed the moment over and over in her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about Susan's hesitant glance, the way she seemed reluctant but didn't voice it outright. "Why didn't I stop her?" she whispered to herself, the weight of regret settling heavily on her shoulders. The following day, the police were contacted. Officers took statements from witnesses at the party, noting the descriptions of the 2 men Susan had left with. Flyers were printed with Susan's photo, her warm smile and bright eyes staring back from every bulletin board in town. Her family refused to let her memory fade into obscurity. Despite their efforts, days turned into weeks and weeks into months. It was as if Susan had vanished into thin air. No sightings, no phone calls, no leads. The only clues remained in the vague and inconsistent stories told by the men she had been last seen with. Stories that failed to add up, but offered no concrete evidence to move forward. Susan Poupart was gone, and the people who loved her were left with a void no words could fill. In their hearts, they knew something terrible had happened, but without answers, they were left in limbo. A purgatory of hope and despair, waiting for the day they would learn the truth. 6 months after Susan's disappearance, 2 hunters made their way through the dense expanse of the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest on November 22, 1990. The towering trees whispered in the breeze, their leaves scattered on the forest floor in a patchwork of gold and brown. It was an ordinary morning for the men, one spent in pursuit of game in the quiet stillness of nature. As they moved deeper into the woods, their conversation faded. The younger hunter slowed his steps, narrowing his eyes at something unusual in the distance. "What's that?" he asked, pointing toward a cluster of downed trees and disturbed earth. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a pile of debris, a mix of branches and trash left behind by careless visitors. But as they drew closer, a smell hit them, sharp and unmistakable. Their light-hearted demeanor evaporated, replaced by an uneasy tension. The older man stopped in his tracks. "We shouldn't be here," he muttered. But the younger one stepped forward, driven by a mix of curiosity and dread. It didn't take long for the truth to reveal itself. Amidst the scattered branches and plastic, they saw it. Remnants of clothing, a purse partially buried, and then something far worse: human remains. The hunters quickly retreated, their hands shaking as they fumbled for the radio to call authorities. By the time law enforcement arrived, the quiet forest had become a flurry of activity. Police officers, forensic teams, and search dogs combed through the area, uncovering more evidence buried beneath layers of leaves and dirt. The remains were badly decomposed, but certain details were clear. Duct tape clung to fragments of clothing, a chilling sign of restraint. Plastic sheets wrapped around parts of the body suggested a deliberate attempt to conceal the crime. Nearby, Susan Poupart's purse and identification confirmed what her family had feared for 6 long months. The hunters who had stumbled upon the remains were questioned on site, their faces pale and their voices shaky. They described how they had first noticed Susan's purse, half buried beneath a pile of harvested branches. Nearby, the officers found more disturbing clues: partially exposed bones, scraps of clothing, and a strong, decaying odor that hung in the air. A forensics team was called in, and by the time they arrived, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The lead forensic investigator, Dr. Elaine Brooks, surveyed the scene with practiced detachment. "Let's start with the immediate area," she instructed her team. "Mark everything, every scrap, every fiber. This might be our only chance to find something usable." As news of the discovery spread, the small community of Lac du Flambeau was thrust into a state of mourning and shock. Susan's parents received the call they had dreaded, their worst fears now a devastating reality. Her children, too young to fully understand, watched as their grandparents struggled to find the words to explain why their mother wasn't coming home. For investigators, the scene provided more questions than answers. The condition of the remains made it difficult to determine the exact cause of death, though evidence of sexual assault was uncovered during the examination. It was clear that whoever had taken Susan's life had gone to great lengths to hide her body, using duct tape and plastic in a calculated effort to delay discovery. The discovery marked the beginning of a grueling process. Evidence from the scene was sent to the lab for analysis, but forensic technology in the early 1990s was limited. Still, they clung to the hope that something, a hair, a fiber, a fingerprint, might lead them to her killer. Susan's friends and family held vigils near the forest's edge, lighting candles and leaving flowers in her memory. Her father spoke to local reporters, his voice breaking as he called for justice. "Someone out there knows what happened to my daughter," he said, his eyes filled with both grief and determination. "We won't stop until we find the truth." In the days following the discovery of Susan Poupart's remains, the investigation shifted focus to the 2 men last seen with her on the night she vanished. Their names had surfaced early in the inquiry, as witnesses at the party recalled seeing them leave with Susan around 4 a.m. Their vague and inconsistent statements only heightened the growing suspicion around them. The taller man, identified as Greg, was well known in the Lac du Flambeau area. He had a reputation for being overconfident and occasionally aggressive, particularly when alcohol was involved. At the party, several attendees remembered him being overly persistent with Susan, cornering her in conversation more than once. The second man, Paul, was quieter, almost fading into the background. But those who knew him described a man who was easily influenced, often acting as a follower to Greg's lead. While Paul's demeanor seemed less threatening, investigators suspected he played a role, even if indirectly. When questioned, both men admitted to being with Susan that night. They claimed they were simply offering her a ride home, a chivalrous gesture, they said, to ensure her safety. But their stories diverged when asked about what happened after they picked her up. Greg told investigators that Susan had grown uncomfortable in the car and asked to be let out. She wanted to walk the rest of the way, he claimed. So we dropped her off near the school and watched her walk off before driving away. When pressed for details, Greg grew defensive. He couldn't remember exactly what time they had dropped her off or whether anyone else was nearby. It was late, okay? I wasn't paying attention to the time. His demeanor during the interview raised red flags. He appeared calm at first, but became agitated when investigators questioned inconsistencies in his story. For instance, witnesses from the party recalled Greg making comments about wanting to spend more time with Susan, a claim he vehemently denied. Paul's account mirrored Greg's in some ways, but contradicted it in others. Like Greg, he said they had dropped Susan off near a local school. However, when asked which school, he hesitated. I don't remember the name, he said. Susan's parents were at the forefront of the search for justice, their grief tempered only by their determination to uncover the truth. Her father, a quiet and stoic man by nature, found himself speaking to reporters, pleading with anyone who might have information to come forward. This isn't just about my daughter, he said during one interview, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion. It's about our entire community. If someone knows something and they're staying silent, they're protecting a monster. But despite their pleas, the leads began to dry up. Law enforcement, stretched thin and lacking modern investigative tools, found themselves running in circles. The evidence collected from the crime scene, duct tape, plastic, and fragments of clothing, provided little in the way of concrete clues. Advanced DNA testing wasn't yet available, and the technology of the time could only go so far. For Susan's family, the lack of progress was infuriating. Her mother, in particular, became increasingly vocal about the investigation's shortcomings. We've done everything we can, she told the local newspaper. We've begged, we've prayed, and we've waited. What more are we supposed to do? The frustration wasn't limited to Susan's family and the community. The investigators assigned to her case were also feeling the strain. Leads that had initially seemed promising had dried up, leaving them chasing whispers and rumors. Detective Carl Monroe, one of the lead investigators, often found himself staring at the evidence board late into the night. Photographs of Susan, the forest where her remains were found, and the two men last seen with her were pinned up in neat rows. But the lines connecting the pieces of evidence felt tenuous at best. We're missing something, he muttered to himself during one late-night session. Something obvious, maybe, or something someone doesn't want us to see. Monroe and his team tried to revisit witnesses, hoping someone's memory might spark a new lead. But most people gave the same answers they had months earlier, and some refused to talk altogether. People are scared, Monroe admitted to his partner. I don't blame them, but it's like hitting a brick wall. In the absence of definitive answers, the rumor mill churned at full speed. Some locals speculated that the two men seen with Susan had been involved in other crimes, suggesting a pattern of violence that had gone unchecked. Others whispered about a possible cover-up, hinting that the killers might have connections that kept them protected. Despite the whispers, few were willing to come forward with concrete information. It's not just fear of the killers, one anonymous resident told a reporter. It's fear of what happens if you stick your neck out. People here don't forget. The state of Susan's remains presented a challenge for investigators. The months she had spent exposed to the elements and the activity of animals had left her skeletonized, with only fragments of soft tissue remaining. Despite this, the forensic team was able to piece together critical details. Dr. Brooks noted signs of trauma to the bones, particularly around the skull, suggesting she may have suffered a violent blow to the head. The condition of her clothing also hinted at a struggle, with torn fabric and markings consistent with an assault. Perhaps the most significant finding was evidence of sexual assault, though the degradation of the remains made it difficult to determine specifics. As the team worked, it became clear that the location had been deliberately chosen. The body had been placed in a remote part of the forest, far from hiking trails or well-traveled roads. The harvested branches piled over her remains seemed almost methodical, as though the perpetrator had taken time to cover their tracks. "It's someone who knows this area," one officer observed. "You don't just stumble on a place like this unless you're familiar with it." The remoteness of the site also posed a challenge for the investigation. No nearby surveillance cameras, no witnesses, and no clear trail leading to or from the scene. Among the debris scattered around the site, investigators found several small but potentially significant clues. A cigarette butt, crushed into the dirt, was bagged and sent for analysis. A single footprint, partially preserved in the soft soil, was photographed and cast. "These are long shots," Dr. Brooks admitted, "but sometimes long shots are all we have." As the evidence was collected and catalogued, a portrait of Susan's final moments began to take shape, but it was an incomplete one. The duct tape and plastic suggested planning, even premeditation, while the remote location hinted at someone who knew the forest well. But the forensic evidence raised as many questions as it answered. Why had Susan been taken to this particular spot? Was it chosen out of convenience, or was there a deeper connection to the killer? Were the duct tape and plastic bought specifically for the purpose of hiding her body? Or had they been improvised? Forensic testing on the duct tape and plastic revealed no fingerprints, though fibers found on the tape suggested it had come into contact with upholstery, possibly from a vehicle. The cigarette butt yielded a partial DNA profile, but without a suspect to compare it to, the lead went cold. In the months that followed the discovery of Susan Poupart's remains, the investigation seemed to stall. The leads, which had once held such promise, dissolved under scrutiny, leaving behind a web of unanswered questions and uncooperative witnesses. As the silence deepened, it became clear that fear and mistrust were tightening their grip on the community of Lac du Flambeau. The small town had never experienced anything like this before. The brutal nature of Susan's death and the lingering presence of her presumed killers created an atmosphere of unease. People spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting to strangers and even neighbors with suspicion. Greg and Paul, the two men who had been with Susan on the night she disappeared, remained at the center of the investigation. While the lack of concrete evidence prevented their arrest, their behavior did little to ease suspicions. Greg, who had initially been eager to cooperate, began avoiding law enforcement. He stopped answering calls and refused further interviews, citing harassment. Paul, on the other hand, appeared nervous and jittery whenever questioned. His accounts of the night grew more inconsistent with time, raising even more red flags. Both men were still seen around town, a constant reminder of the case's unresolved nature. Their presence only deepened the community's anxiety. "Every time I see them, I feel sick," said one of Susan's former friends. "They know something, they have to, but they just keep walking around like nothing ever happened." What frustrated investigators most were the potential witnesses who refused to come forward. At the party Susan had attended, there had been dozens of people, some of whom likely saw or heard something that could break the case wide open. Detective Carl Monroe made several attempts to re-interview attendees, but he was met with resistance at every turn. "It's not that they don't know," he confided to a colleague. "It's that they're too afraid to tell us." One woman, who had been close to Susan, agreed to a private meeting with Monroe, but refused to let her name be attached to any official report. "I heard them arguing," she admitted, her voice trembling. Susan didn't want to go with them, but they wouldn't take no for an answer. When asked why she hadn't come forward sooner, the woman shook her head. "Do you think they wouldn't come after me next? Or my family? It's not worth it." The tension reached a boiling point one evening at a local bar, where Greg and Paul were drinking with a group of friends. A man from the community, emboldened by alcohol and anger, confronted them directly. "You think everyone doesn't know what you did?" he spat, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "You think you're going to get away with it?" Greg's expression darkened, and he stood up, towering over the man. "You better watch yourself," he growled. "You don't know what you're talking about." The bar fell silent as the two men stared each other down. Eventually, the man backed off, muttering curses as he left. But the incident only reinforced the community's fear. If Greg and Paul were willing to lash out in public, what might they do in private? For Susan's family, the silence was unbearable. Her parents, once hopeful that justice would be swift, now carried the weight of unspoken truths. They felt betrayed, not just by the men who had taken their daughter's life, but by the community that seemed unwilling to help bring them to justice. The heat of cooperation from witnesses left the police in a difficult position. Without solid evidence, they couldn't make arrests, and the forensic clues gathered from the forest offered only limited leads. Detective Monroe spent countless hours reviewing the case file, poring over every piece of evidence and rereading every interview transcript. "We're missing something," he told his team during a late-night meeting. "There's a piece of this puzzle we haven't found yet, and I guarantee it's in this town." Was right, but finding it would require breaking through the wall of Lac du Flambeau. Susan's case also attracted renewed interest from national media outlets. Documentaries, podcasts, and investigative reports delved into the details of her murder, bringing fresh attention to the circumstances of her death and the challenges faced by investigators. One such documentary, released in 2021, included interviews with Susan's family, former investigators, and activists. The film highlighted the systemic barriers to justice in cases involving Native women, including jurisdictional disputes, limited resources, and cultural misunderstandings. The documentary reignited public interest in the case, leading to a flood of tips and calls to law enforcement. While many of these leads proved fruitless, the increased scrutiny kept pressure on those who might hold the key to solving the case. For Susan's family and the broader Indigenous community, the fight for justice became a pathway to healing. Annual memorial walks in her honor grew in size and significance, drawing participants from across the country. At one such walk in 2022, Susan's daughter addressed the crowd with a message of hope and resilience. "This is about more than my mom," she said. "This is about every woman who has been silenced, every family who has been left to grieve without answers. Together, we can make sure their stories are heard." The walk concluded with a candlelight vigil at the edge of the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, where Susan's remains had been found decades earlier. The forest, once a symbol of horror and loss, had become a place of remembrance and unity. While Susan's murder remained unresolved, the impact of her case went far beyond the boundaries of Lac du Flambeau. It became a catalyst for change, inspiring new policies and practices aimed at addressing the crisis of violence against Indigenous women. In 2023, a federal task force on MMIBU cases cited Susan's story as a turning point in the national conversation. Her case reminded us of the cost of inaction. The task force's report stated, "It underscored the urgent need for systemic reform and the importance of centering the voices of victims and their families." By 2025, Susan's story had become a powerful symbol of resilience and determination. While the case itself remained open, the legacy of her life and the fight for justice had left an indelible mark on her family, her community, and the nation. For Susan's loved ones, the journey was far from over. "We still don't have the answers we need," her daughter said in an interview, "but we have something just as important, a community that refuses to forget, and a movement that refuses to stop." My mom's story isn't just about loss, it's about strength. It's about love. And it's about the fight for justice that will carry forward, no matter how long it takes. As the sun set on yet another year without resolution, the memory of Susan Poupart shone brighter than ever. A beacon of hope, a call to action, and a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, the fight for justice is always worth pursuing. Thanks for watching. Please turn on post notifications, like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from.